Welcome everyone to the next edition of the White Too Long Author Forum. I am Robert P. Jones, also known as Robbie, to people I know, like my friend Brad here tonight. And we are here tonight to have a conversation with Brad Onishi. I'm going to give him an introduction in a moment, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we do. The chat is open. If you would love to, you're welcome to kind of chime in and put your first name and where you're from. It's always kind of interesting to see where people are from. Brad and I are joining us. We have Coast to Coast going on tonight. So Brad is all the way out on the West Coast and I'm here on the East Coast. So we'll see who else we have in between in the meantime. We will go about 30 minutes, Brad and I, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. If you'll use the Q&A part in Zoom to put your questions, that'll kind of help me kind of move through them and make sure we get to everyone. Hopefully we'll get to everyone. Look, we got somebody from Colorado. There we go, halfway between us here in the chat. So anyway, so let me jump off with just tell you a little bit about Brad. So Brad, you and I have known each other a while. Am I right that we met at AAR? Is that the first time we met?
I think the first time we met in person was at AAR 2022 at the Denver event, but I had interviewed you for my show, I think, in 2020.
Right, when
so
nobody was meeting anyone in person.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, great. Yeah. So we've known each other a while. I was really excited to see Brad's book come out. It is newly out in paperback edition, as is my book. So our books are kind of on the same schedule. But just a little bit about Brad, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. So Brad Onishi is a social commentator, scholar. He is, where I got to know him, the co-host of Straight White American Jesus podcast. I'll get you to explain that name in a moment. But he also has a new venture, Axis Mundi Media. Am I saying that right?
Yep, that's good.
Axis Mundi Media that he just started last year. That's a platform for research-based podcasts focused on safeguarding democracy. So that should sound familiar to many of us. And his writing has appeared all over the place, the New York Times, Politico, Rolling Stone. He was recently on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, where some of you may have caught him. Also been on MSNBC, and has the distinction of his podcast, Straight White American Jesus, ranks in the top 50 politics shows. So that's a pretty good deal for a religion scholar, and shows up on Apple podcast charts, even ahead of programs like NPR, the New York Times, and other kind of more national outlets. So Brad, I'm really happy to have you here with us and taking the time out. Before we got on, we were both talking about it's an exhausting time. So I really do appreciate you taking your time to be with us and kind of share your wisdom with us tonight.
No, it's a true privilege. I was up in Spokane last week and I asked the audience, who's feeling anxious? And sometimes you ask an audience a question and like 4 people, it's like, who's read this book? And it's like 3 people out of 100. Who's feeling anxious? And it was like, everyone in the audience almost like dislocated their shoulder because they were raising their hands so quickly. So I know we're all feeling it right now.
Yeah, no, amen to that. Yeah, I think it's just good to name that's in the room. People are probably not sleeping as well, eating as well, all of that stuff, anxiety, fairly high. And we are down the home stretch, right, headed to the election. And just, I always try to say a reminder is that, we're not just going to have election day. So we all have to kind of buckle up to realize it's going to be election week. Probably, and maybe even a little longer before all the dust settles. So just kind of, we're all going to have to kind of hold each other up next week because it's probably going to be a long slog as close as this election is in as many places as it's close. And particularly all the battleground states are just neck and neck and kind of a coin toss. So we can talk about that later, but we're here today to talk about Brad's book. Again, it is newly out in paperback. I've got links for you to buy it. I would highly recommend you buy it. The thing about the book is that I love is it is both got all the scholarly apparatus in it and well documented, well researched, but it's also kind of a personal story. So again, the book is Preparing for War: The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism, and we're definitely going to get to the last part of the subtitle, and what comes next. But before we get to what comes next, Brad, why don't we start with a little bit of your story, because I do appreciate that put your own story in there, to maybe help us locate you, right? So where do you sit in relationship to this story?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think like a lot of folks, I have my own personal interactions with Christian nationalism. I grew up in Southern California, in Richard Nixon country, so right over the 10 minutes, 15 minutes from Disneyland. And at age 14, converted at a mega church. I was from for the most part religious, non-religious home. And I was invited by a girlfriend to, my eighth grade girlfriend, to Wednesday night Bible study. And this seemed like a perfect plan as an eighth grader. Like, I was getting in trouble a lot, and I knew my mom would never like agree to let me out of the house on a Wednesday, much less to see my girlfriend. So if I was like, "Hey, these kids at school want to go to church tonight. That seems like a good idea." And she was like, "It does. That might set you on the straight and narrow." So I got there thinking, find girlfriend, ditched Bible study, hang out with her, and then that's genius. What I found was all the trappings of a Southern California megachurch. I found leaders and youth group pastors who were in their 20s and playing guitar, and they had tattoos, and they welcomed me even though I was dressed like Kurt Cobain, or it was like the 1990s and I was dressed like a full-on grunge kid. They didn't turn me away. They didn't think that I didn't fit in, and church became my second home. I converted in an extreme way. So I went from that kid who was, on Friday night telling mom to drop him off at the movie theater, then going behind the movie theater and doing dumb teenage stuff, to like stand out in front of the movie theater and ask people as they come out, "Hey, have you met our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? Do you know where you're going to spend eternity?" Um, by the time I was 18, I was in ministry at the church where I converted. And then by the time I was 20, I finished my second year of college at a Christian evangelical university in LA. Got married to my high school sweetheart and took over the youth group that I converted in. So I was then in charge of 200 kids. So I was a college sophomore. I was married. I was in charge of a 200-person ministry and headed to seminary as soon as I graduated. So when I say I converted, it wasn't like a kind of, I wasn't dabbling. I was fully committed.
All in, yeah.
Yep. And my church, I think one of the things that's hard to explain to folks is uh, Southern California is not the place. I know you're from Mississippi. A lot of folks envision that as a highly religious place, conservative, evangelical, and so on. Southern California is often a place people think is liberal, or hey, everyone's wearing a Hawaiian shirt and going to the beach and that kind of stuff. That part of Southern California is really known as the Bible Belt. There are as many churches on street corners and in your neighborhood as there would be in Tennessee or in Indiana or in Georgia. It's a highly churched place, and it's a place that has a deep history with American conservatism. So, like I said, the church that I was in was started by Richard Nixon's parents, among other people. Uh, Orange County was, of course, the place that like went bonkers for Barry Goldwater in 1964. It was Reagan's kind of spiritual political home. It's kind of where he felt like he was really with his people. And we named our airport after John Wayne. So that's, any fans of Christian Dumais out there know that I don't have to say anything more about John Wayne to explain what that means in terms of the kind of ethos of the whole region. So I can talk more about that, but I didn't grow up in Berkeley, California. I grew up in a different venue.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to come to January 6th a little bit later, because I want you to connect the dots to there eventually. But where did things shift for you? So obviously, you've been on a bit of a journey to write the book you did with that background. So maybe just talk a little bit about where you began and why, or kind of what led you to get some critical distance from that world that you were so inside of, right? As someone who grew up going to a Southern Baptist church 5 days a week, leader in the youth group. I mean, all that sounds very familiar to me. It's hard to get out, to get any distance to see it, right, from the outside. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like a lot of folks who end up in a different place, it wasn't that I didn't care. It was that I cared with every fiber of my being. And so I wanted to read and learn everything I could about our world, about our theological understanding of everything from original sin to atonement. I wanted to think with great Christians of the past, Augustine and Aquinas. So, when I got to college, even Christian university, I started reading voraciously, right? And my intellectual pursuits just became obsessive. I wanted to learn everything I could about philosophy and theology and history. And I don't know if you ever heard this. I'm sure you heard a version, but you read too many books and your brain will take your heart away from Christ. And it wasn't that is what happened per se. It was more that the more I read, the more I started to contextualize our understanding of the gospel. I started to think of our understanding of the gospel as intertwined with a certain Americanism. I started to see us as not carrying on a tradition of Christian ethics or Christian practice, but as kind of newbies who were doing things that maybe a lot of Christians from the past would have thought that's actually novel. That's not traditional like you think it is. So when I was 24, 23, I finished a 2-year seminary degree, and I devised another genius plan, just like my one to meet my girlfriend on a Wednesday night. And that was my wife and I were going to move overseas. She was an athlete, so she was going to play pro basketball or semi-pro basketball, and I was going to study theology. And this was a soft landing because I could tell everyone in the church, and I was in ministry at the time, and you know how hard it is. You can't just up and say, my whole life for 11 years was enveloped by this community. I had no friends outside this community. I had no social life. I had no professional aspirations or training. I had no understanding of my own identity outside of this church. So I was going through a dark night of the soul, but I couldn't tell anyone that. I couldn't explain that to him. And anytime I did, I got in trouble. They would look at me like I was, suspiciously. So my ingenious plan was, I'm not gonna be a missionary or a senior pastor like they want me to be. I'm gonna be a Christian theologian and teach at a Christian university. So we decided we were gonna move to England, which is very far away from California. She was going to play basketball. I was going to go to grad school. I finagled my way, and this is a whole nother story. And if I'm sure there's very few interested, but if anyone's interested, there's a whole story of me hiding in the bushes and, finagling my way into Oxford University. But somehow I convinced Oxford University to allow me in to get a master's degree. So we moved to Oxford, and, within 6 months of moving there, a weight was lifted from my shoulders, because instead of going to the grocery store and seeing 10 folks from church, instead of going to the coffee shop and having people scrutinize my books, and I wasn't reading like radical things. I was reading like Karl Barth, right? Or Jürgen Moltmann, and people thinking, it's kind of European, seems liberal. I don't know about that, Onishi. All of a sudden I was free. I could think, I could read, I could discuss with others. And as the story goes, and I'm sure many people can anticipate, that drastically changed my theology, my practice, my understanding of myself and the world. So from there, I became a religion professor, not a theologian. And I've been studying religion since then, kind of from the outside, as they say, from a religious studies perspective, rather than from a theologian's perspective. So historically, philosophically, social scientifically, and that's kind of, what lands me in the present to write this book and do all this other stuff I do.
Yeah, well, so thank you for all that. It's fascinating. I do want to hear the story. I haven't heard the story. Maybe over here at AAR, you could tell me the story of you hiding in the bushes to get into to Oxford. But in the meantime, your book does give us, I think, a really compelling narrative of, the question that's on everybody's minds, right? Is, boy, how did we get to this place that we're at? Like, where particularly white evangelical Christianity looks the way it looks, is aligned with the forces it's aligned with. And that does seem, even for someone like me who grew up inside that world, it still seems like a pretty far journey that we are where we are. And there's just virtually not that many voices left, even lamenting it or calling it out at this point, even compared to 2016. But so tell us a little bit about that, what you call the kind of the new Christian right, and how that kind of leads us into this, more violent and extremist form of white Christian nationalism that we're seeing right now. That's all kind of tied in with the MAGA movement.
One of the things I like to do at the beginning of talking about Christian nationalism is ask folks to envision a round table of people who represent every dimension of America, every ethnic and racial, every religious dimension, gender, sex identities. And imagine that round table and everyone's there and we're supposed to have the same rights, the same representation, the same equality, the same freedom to pursue life, liberty, happiness. And before that, the white Christian, right, the ostensibly white evangelical, but white Christian stands up and says, "Hey, before we start the meeting, I just want everyone to know I'm going to get more of a say here, just because. And as long as you know that and you accept it, we'll be good. And I think most of you will. But if you don't, there might be trouble." And the 1960s is where I start my book, and it's really because that was a moment in United States history where a lot of people around that round table said, "No, we actually don't accept that anymore." Civil rights movement, women's rights movements, immigration reform, Voting Rights Act, Stonewall. I mean, we could talk about the 1960s for the next hour. That's a moment when a lot of people around the round table say, "No, thank you. Actually, we don't accept that you'll get an elevated status above everyone else. And we're actually going to say that all of us get equal representation and rights." That's also the moment that a candidate like Barry Goldwater, who many conservative white evangelicals and Christians went for in 1964, the Deep South plus Arizona. And if you looked at California, my region of California, they were pretty crazy for Goldwater. And without going into the weeds on him, what is his most famous line? His most famous line is, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Basically saying, hey, if you're with me and you're with this movement and you want to get the power over that round table back, you might need to be an extremist. That's actually probably how you need to think of yourself, because otherwise you'll never get the authority over the United States and its constituents again. And so he loses that election. But in my mind, he gives a permission structure for extremism that never left. And if we fast forward all the way till now, we see that when that white conservative Christian looks across that round table, as you've documented, Robbie, we're no longer a majority white Christian nation. We haven't been for a decade. The country seems to get more and more diverse, less and less religious, more queer folks, part of Gen Z than any other generation. They're looking across that round table and realizing we're never going to get this back by a majority. We're not going to have the votes or when we raise our hands, 51% is not going to ever be with us ever again. And so the conclusion, in my view at least, is that extremism, violence, radicalism, these are your next steps, because democracy is no longer seen as an answer. It's actually seen as a problem. And I think that's, without going into all the historical details, one way to kind of think of the last 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, you've got this chapter title, maybe just expand a little bit, that it's on this theme, but it's one of those that just jumps off the page at you. And it is killing democracy to save the nation. So maybe just unpack that a little bit. I mean, it's close to, you've teed it up really well, but unpack that a little bit.
Well, one of the things that surprised people when Trump became president and we had the whole Russiagate issue was all of these ties to Russia. And all of a sudden, not only were there ties in the Trump campaign, whether it was Paul Manafort or anyone else to Russia, but there was a kind of admiration for Vladimir Putin that, hey, what happened? How come so many conservative religious people in this country now see Putin as a kind of ideal Christian leader? Give talks around the country, and I show people clips of like Lauren Vitska, the GOP's candidate for Senate in Delaware from 2020, saying that she's a Christian nationalist who thinks Putin is a much better leader than any president we have here. She even says in one clip she wished Putin would invade the United States to free us from the Biden administration. This was somebody who was a candidate for United States Senate. And what I argue in that chapter is if you look back 20, 25 years, people like Paul Weyrich and others, they started taking trips to Russia. They started seeing Russia as a kind of beacon of freedom well before that Trump ever came on the scene as a politician. And for me, one of the reasons that change came about was you have somebody in Putin, or it could be Orban's Hungary, we could have other examples, who's doing a couple things, who's saying that they are going to restore traditional family values. They're going to do so in the name of the Christian heritage of their nation. And that's why they need to take control of the media or the parliament or the judiciary. That's why they need to have complete control over the educational system, because democracy won't do it. And in fact, if we just let me, the kind of authoritarian leader who represents God and people, do it, the action will be much more swift, much more decisive. and things will actually get done. And if you're looking around the round table and you're realizing that you're now 13 or 14% of the United States rather than anything close to a majority, and you see leaders like Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or whoever else that you have construed into an image of the antithesis of the Christian candidate, there's a lot of people who end up thinking of Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban as the ideal Christian leader. And as a result, they start thinking of democracy not as an answer that if we just vote and we do our civic duty, we'll be in a better place as a nation. Rather, they conclude we probably need a Caesar or a monarch or a Christian prince to kind of take control and decisively overrun the nation so that we can get rid of the degeneracy that's taken over when all these people at the round table started demanding their rights and their representation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not lost to me too that when very recently when Trump was asked about world leaders who loved him, his primary example that he gave was Viktor Orban, right? Who's famous for saying I'm not for a liberal democracy, I'm for an illiberal democracy, right? That has an authoritarian leader that's exactly right, who can kind of swiftly and with a kind of mercilessness of a dictator, just institute policies, run roughshod over anyone in his way. So for everyone here, we're going to go in about 10 minutes. We're going to go to questions. So if you want to go ahead and start putting some questions in the Q&A box there, we will pick them up in about 10 minutes. So I got to ask you about, because you also spell this out really well in the book, and it is part of this worldview, but I want to just spend a little bit of time with it because I think I grew up a little bit with this worldview of spiritual warfare. The name of the book is Preparing for War. And you talk about the kind of militant, and violent even metaphors, right? In songs, in prayers, in which scriptures get read and how they get interpreted. And this kind of mash of, demons, territory, and violence, right? That is all wrapped up with a kind of Christian theology that really just trades on these kinds of tropes, and they've kind of escaped the world of metaphor, right? And have kind of been really pushed into something quite literal today.
Yeah, I think this is something that's really important. One of the things that I focus on in the book is January 6th, and I kind of wonder if I would have been there because as a 19-year-old, I was the kind of guy who, if an older, Christian man at my church would have said, "Hey, we're going to DC to protect God and country. Are you with us?" Maybe 19-year-old me says, "Yeah, let's go." And that's pretty scary for me. But like you and so many others, I've studied the symbology and the ritual at J6, and what you see there are so many representations of spiritual warfare, of trying to cast out demons from the United States and our capital. But one of the things that stood out even before January 6th was the night before, January 5th, and before that, there was a number of Jericho marches all over state capitals, swing states, and then of course in Washington D.C. And I don't know about you, Robbie, but when I was in church, I taught the story of Jericho a lot because you teach 14-year-olds. That's an easy Sunday. That is so much better than most of Deuteronomy. I mean, that's fun. I'm going to wake up on that Sunday feeling like I got
I'm going to
this.
march, right?
Yeah, no big deal, And there's an easy lesson. Hey, if you trust God and you march around the walls, even though you seem crazy,
tumbling down, right? Yeah.
And the world will think you're crazy, but God does miracles if we have faith. All right, everyone go get a donut. Good job. Good Sunday school today. Happy. Yay. Good job. What I never taught was that what happens in that story is after the walls fall down, the Israelites, of course, go into Jericho and they kill almost everyone, if not everyone, the men, the women, the children, the animals. It's one of the most violent stories of the Hebrew Bible. And don't get me wrong, there are Jewish and Christian interpreters and communities who've done a lot to interrogate what that means. Okay, what does this text mean, and so on. I don't see any of that interrogation or confrontation happening in the Jericho marches. What I see is them saying, just as Israel marched into Jericho, we as the Christians of this country will have the walls fall down, and then we will march into our nation's capital. And we will be, right, like Joshua and the Israelites in that story, meaning we're putting ourselves in the place of those who committed physical violence in a very, very vicious way. And so when I think of January 6th, I think of the biblical stories and the ways that they're framed that these folks are living out. Spiritual warfare is one step away from actual physical warfare. And when you're primed to think of other people, whether they're political opponents or folks who don't agree with you, not as like, you're a citizen, I'm a citizen, you're a human, I'm a human, we disagree. When you're primed to think of Kamala Harris, as Lance Wallnau says, as having a demon speak through her, you're primed to take drastic action to prevent her from gaining power or from her policies from taking effect. So you're primed to do things, once again, going back to Goldwater, that are probably extremist, but you're going to think of as necessary or in God's will. And so that's how I interpret January 6th. That's how I interpret the overwhelming popularity of the New Apostolic Reformation and Lance Wallnau, Dutch Sheets, Cindy Jacobs, Paula White, all of their influence over things, the Million Woman March that happened 3 weeks ago or 2.5 weeks ago, whenever it was, Sean Foyt, and so on. The spiritual warfare motif and that practice has made its way to the mainstream. I don't know if when you were in a Southern Baptist church growing up, but, you know, we knew about the Vineyard when I was growing up, but the Vineyard was considered kind of a little beyond our boundaries, right? The charismatic church, speaking in tongues, right? Lots of things we didn't do. These days, those things, the charismaticization of evangelical Christianity is full on, and that includes the spiritual warfare motifs.
No, thanks for that. That's super helpful. Yeah, I think that's right. What you said, I said, version of this as well, that, it's just the end of democracy, right? If we can't think of our fellow citizens as people who, no matter how badly we believe they're wrong, how much we disagree with them, but if we can't see them as human beings who are acting, trying to act with their best lights, even if we think they're mistaken, that really is the end of democracy, right? If they become instruments literally, and not just figuratively, but literally instruments of the devil, right? Which is the language we heard just the other night from Madison Square Garden, right?
Yep.
Then that really is fundamentally, anti-democratic. So I'm going to jump here, I think, to some questions. We get some good questions coming in, and I may jump back in too as well. So there's a question from Harley. How does the Christian school movement fit into all of this? I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
I have a lot of thoughts, and I know maybe you should jump in because you know more about this than me. But I think like a lot of other scholars, one of the things I tried to make clear in the book is that yes, issues like abortion and quote unquote family values in the 1970s, they really had an effect on mobilizing a kind of evangelical Catholic alliance that is still with us today in many ways. But before that, we of course had Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, and then a series of other court cases that really made it such that schools needed to be integrated, and schools in the South, especially, were pretty resistant to this. Virginia, Mississippi, and so on. And this really mobilized a Protestant Christian kind of school movement where all of a sudden every church in town has a school attached to it. And you start to examine those schools and they look like they're kind of whites only. And eventually the federal government says, hey, cut it out or we're going to take away your tax exempt status. To me, that's a beginning of a very, very long story of seeing our public schools not as places where we practice and learn democracy, where we teach kids how to essentially practice what it means to be a citizen in a democratic republic and a multiracial, pluralistic public square, but as places where they're indoctrinated, places where you're no longer allowed to bring God in and have the Ten Commandments displayed and prayer in the school and Bible teaching and so on. But what that's led to is a billionaire-backed attempt to weaken our public schools and ostensibly destroy them. I'll point people to one great new book that I think is really valuable. It's a pretty quick read, and that's by Josh Cowan, The Privateers. And he really documents from an educator's perspective the ways that the Christian school movement and the attacks on public schools are not only to siphon money through vouchers to private schools so that you can use taxpayer money to pay for your kid to go to a private school, but they're also to weaken the public schools to the point of collapse. I mean, I saw a statistic the other day that said that over the last number of years, we've spent something like $3 billion either on vouchers for private schools or fighting lawsuits and other things against public schools. And you might think, well, that's too bad. But a lot of the folks, the billionaires and others in this movement see that as victory. They see, yeah, we're close to cratering the public school system. And why would you want to do that? Well, one of the reasons you'd want to do that is because, once again, in my mind at least, public schools are a place where we learn a lot of things, but one of them is to live with our neighbor who's probably different than us, to, go to school and class and play sports with somebody who's a different race, different religion, different background, different immigration story. That's the kind of stuff that builds a multiracial pluralistic democracy. Well, if you don't want that, as we've been talking about already tonight, the public schools are a really good place to attack and to try to implode. And so the Christian school movement to me is always hand in hand with the goal of destroying the public school movement.
Yeah, and there's no doubt certainly the modern Christian school movement, I mean, absolutely, the birth of it is Brown v. Board of Education, as you said. I mean, there's just no other way to understand that phenomenon. One of the most heartbreaking things I remember reading was actually a study that the National Council of Churches put together in the late 60s. And they sent a kind of group of folks to come just take a tour of the South and study the kind of Christian academy world, like what was going on in the South. And they had this line in there that I'll just never forget reading. They basically said, look, we concluded that if you go into a town and you see a school that has the words Christian Academy in its name, you can bet that it was formed after 1954 and it was set up to be a segregation academy where white kids could flee the public schools there. And part of the I think the logic of it that I think ties it together too is this idea that we've come at like the demonic, right, and territory, right, and that the public schools have become the domain, literally the domain, right, of the demonic. And so sending your kids there are, from that worldview, you are sending your kids into the domain of the demonic. And why would you do that, right, from that worldview? But that's a sort of a thin theological, I think, veneer over what has really been about white supremacy, and again, kind of holding a lock on power. And ultimately, yeah, weakening the public schools and funneling that money right into those schools where they can kind of hold on to kind of a white Christian nationalist, worldview.
Yeah.
So let me jump to another question here in the Q&A. So we're still taking questions. Please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I think I see one in the chat. I'll pop over there and get that one after this. So Steve says, I just wrote a book about the cancer of fundamentalism. Your book seems to speak about my perspective that religion isn't the opiate of the masses, it's the destruction of democracy. So I don't know, Brad, would you take it that far?
I wouldn't say that religion in general is the destruction of democracy. No, I don't think that. I've had a long journey from my conversion to evangelicalism to where I am today. I am somebody who's kind of a weird guy. I just in Spokane spoke at an American Atheist event, but I spend a lot of time in church, and I speak at a lot of churches across the country as well. I think for me there are pro-social forms of religion that are compatible with and actually quite helpful to democracies like the one that we purport to have and want. What I tell my students a lot is that we can examine those pro-social dynamics, and we're also going to examine the ways that religious communities and traditions have been anti-democratic and quite hurtful or quite oppressive to many people. So I want to, as a scholar, I want to take an unflinching look at all of those things, but I don't come down on the side of religion as simply in total as anti-democratic. I don't hold that view, and I don't think that that's accurate. I understand why, if you come out of fundamentalism or a certain tradition, it may seem that way and it may feel that way. So I don't want to discount how those experiences can shape your view of things, and I get it. But I don't think that claiming religion as anti-democratic writ large helps us in any way. And I actually don't think it's accurate when I look at the diversity of religious traditions in this country and around the world.
Yeah. I also think of my friend Jamar Tisby here, who just wrote this great book called The Spirit of Justice, where he gives all these examples from the African American religious Christian tradition, that is absolutely about expanding the realm of equality, expanding the realm of liberty, embracing pluralism, and and kind of says that he's pretty much saying more than once, look, all you white people, you forget there's another Christian tradition over here, right? That actually has been from the beginning, really trying to hold up more of these values that in the kind of white churches we've really struggled with, because so much of it has been around kind of maintaining a certain kind of social and political power, as in addition to whatever theology work is going on there. So let me get another question here. So twofer here. Can you name any clarion voices from, say, that early Christian right era, the 70s and 80s, who saw coming this desire to erode democracy? And then second part, unrelated, do you see that dispensationalism or end times theology, like Left Behind, as contributing to this desire to refuse the mark of the beast and feel like you're standing firm for God? So there's two, one kind of more academic, one theological.
Yeah, big question. So I think there's a lot of folks who saw this coming. I think you just mentioned the civil rights movement, Robbie. We can dig into the ways that in 1965, Jerry Falwell gave one of his most famous sermons about ministers and marches, and claimed that Martin Luther King Jr. Was not a real American, not a real Christian, might be a communist, and that Christians should not be, of course, out marching in Selma or any other place. So I think there were people in the civil rights movement who were part of what we might term the religious left, or something else, that saw the anti-democratic forces at play as they lived the racism and the Jim Crow South and so on and so forth. So there's, as you just mentioned, Jamar and others will always point folks to those long and wide traditions. Within the kind of white evangelical fold, I always come back to this 1973 gathering in Chicago of evangelicals who really wanted to think of their evangelicalism as something they maintained while advocating for feminism, while advocating for environmental ethic that recognized climate change and the need to be stewards of the earth in different ways, recognize the need for racial justice. And I think of that Chicago Declaration that they put out as really one of the last gasps before the religious right had its stranglehold, because I think they saw what was coming very clearly. I'll mention one more, and this is a fascinating part of all this, is Barry Goldwater himself. By the time Barry Goldwater gets to the mid 1980s, the man who really courted the John Birch Society and many of the Christian extremists from my neck of the woods saw them as anti-democratic and a true danger to the United States. And so, the story plays out over and over again. Somebody who courts a certain fanaticism and extremism ends up realizing that they can't put that back in the bottle. And what have I done? This might destroy our republic. Well, I think those are some interesting examples. In terms of Left Behind, this is all fascinating.
Yeah, now that book did make its way into my Southern Baptist world.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was allowed? Was that one
Oh yeah,
like
it
on the
was.
shelves?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That now raising your hands in worship, we had a whole deacons meeting about whether that was going to be okay or not okay, and voted, literally had a church vote that no, those Pentecostal worship practices were not okay. We were not
That's
doing that
amazing.
in our Baptist church. We literally voted on this in our church. But the books, on the other hand, definitely made their way through the youth group. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So I'll just say I spent many Friday nights, your crazy Friday nights in high school, drinking Diet Coke and eating popcorn and talking about whether the rapture was going to be pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib. So that was kind of how we spent our Friday nights in my circle. So it was a pretty wild time. Um, I want to say a couple things. I think there's a great new book out that no one's read because it came out like 3 days ago. It's by Yi John Lin, who teaches at Yale Divinity School, and it's all about apocalypse and immigration. It's about how the book of Revelation has shaped immigration and immigration policy in this country. So if you need a book to read post-election, regardless of how it goes, check out Yi John's book. John is how she goes, because it's really, really fascinating, and it really gives you a perspective on this whole question that I can't pretend to even understand in the way she does.
Okay. What's the name of the book again? Can you give it one more time?
Apocalypse and Immigration. I'll look it up and I
Okay.
can try and put the link in the chat here.
Great.
But I do think that dispensationalism and end times theology had a big effect on the ways that I at least engage with the public square. I don't know about you, Robbie, when you were kind of in that world. It was something I thought about a lot. It motivated me a lot. I I would ask kids in my high school, I'd ask kids at the movie theater, did they know Jesus? Because I was convinced Jesus was going to return at any moment. Um, it also shaped, I think, a kind of scorched earth politics that we had,
Mhm.
and not seeing ourselves as part of the world and thus not needing to invest in it, whether it was a matter of um, rectifying social inequalities, confronting racism, dealing with climate change. Those were not our issues because we're leaving soon and we just need to convert people. And the way that I look at that now is that's a nice excuse, right? It's a nice excuse to say that if Jesus is coming soon, I don't need to care about you being discriminated against. I don't need to care about the destruction of our environment. I don't need to care about uh, income inequality or housing issues because we need to just convert souls. And it's a nice out, right? It's a nice way to kind of skirt some of that.
The thing that's helped me, because that was clearly, yeah, we watched the Thief in the Night movie and all that
Yep.
stuff about people being raptured. But the thing that helped me make sense of it all, kind of looking back as a scholar, was realizing that, Mr. Cyrus Schofield, who was one of the people who most popularized this view through the Schofield Reference Bible, which plenty of people in my church also carried that Bible around, this little tabs and stuff in the back explaining all this stuff. But he was really part of lost cause theology, right?
Yeah.
A kind of Confederate lost cause theology, and that sea change, right? So the Confederacy was a very optimistic worldview, right? They were like, the Confederate Constitution, unlike the U.S. Constitution, is a theological document. It has like references to God in the Confederate Constitution, and it's because they really did believe that the Confederacy was going to be the perfected version of human society, right? And this hierarchical view of whites over non-whites and enslaving others, all was part of God's plan for the perfect human society. And when all that fell through, that's when this idea, okay, we're not about then bringing the kingdom of God on earth, which we thought looked like that, but it's no longer going to happen, and none of this really matters anymore, right? And so if you understand like why that got such a toehold among the people who were defeated after the Civil War, who were on the Confederate side of the Civil War, it all begins to make a lot more theological sense.
Well,
Um,
and
yeah.
I'll just add quickly that it also it also is new. Like when I as a young man discovered, hey, most Christians throughout history probably didn't believe in the rapture like I do. I realized I'm not a traditional Christian. I'm kind of a novel Christian. And what does that say about everything I thought about myself is going back to the early church? None of that is something I can claim anymore because this dispensationalism is actually a 19th century or 20th century invention rather than a first century sort of belief or worldview. And that kind of shattered things for me too. It was like, you're telling me the apostles and the early church didn't think this. Well, why should I think it? And so that was a big moment.
Yeah, great. So we've got one more question here from David, and it's going to take us into the future, which is probably good. We got about 15 minutes left, a little less than that. But it relates to the very end of the subtitle of your book, which is "And What Comes Next." So David is leaning in to that question, so you can kind of talk about it. I think both out of what you wrote in the book, and then we can also talk about kind of where we are right here tonight, just a few days before the next presidential election. But David says, as a people of faith, what is our defense in the face of another Trump presidency? God forbid. That's David's question.
Yeah. So um, if I just take what comes next, I think the last chapter of my book is one where I tried to sort of point to a movement that not a lot of folks talk about if they don't live in these regions. Some of you I saw are from the Pacific Northwest, but I talked about the American Redoubt, and I talk about a movement that started kind of 15 years ago, a little further back, where folks began to move to Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon as a kind of refuge from the rest of American society. And they started to see this as one of the last places in the country where they could build something like the ideal Christian society without interference from all those other pesky people who sit at that American round table that I mentioned at the beginning tonight. And one of the reasons I think this is interesting is because there's this concerted effort by folks to move among folks like them and try to create this sort of Christian, theocratic is too strong a word, I think, but Christian supremacist kind of society. And, you know, I'm from Southern California, and I know everyone around the country hates Californians because we moved to your region and we ruin it. So if you're in Portland, if you're in Denver, I know you hate Californians. If you're in Austin, I get it. You don't have to email me. I totally understand why. But if you said, hey, where are the people from high school or from church that they've moved and you know the most people, right? Nashville is a contender, but the state of Idaho is the winner.
Mm.
And that's a weird thing. We grew up like next to Disneyland and the beach. We didn't think of Idaho growing up as like, oh, that's where I really want to go. It was like, well, we have Disneyland, we have the beach, we have Southern California, we have no winter. Why would I want to move? But somewhere along the line, where I grew up became more diverse, more liberal. It voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. There was a blue wave in Congress. And all of a sudden, a lot of people looked around and thought, this is starting to look like that American roundtable I've been hearing about. A lot more Asian people, a lot more brown people, less Christians. Let's go to Idaho. And people say, well, why Idaho? And I say, well, look, it's beautiful. I was just in Spokane. That part of the country is just breathtaking. But if you try this in Texas, I'm talking like a statewide takeover. I know everyone's going to think, well, Texas. But if you go to Houston, like the third biggest city we have in this country, man, large scale Black communities, large scale Latinx communities, large scale Asian communities. Houston is full of queer folks and non-binary folks. And to some, Austin is Austin. It's more white, but it's progressively, it's progressive when it comes to politics. We have San Antonio, we have like Texas is majority pretty much at this point, or it's very close. You can't do this in Texas. You can't do this in Georgia. Go ask Stacey Abrams. She's not going to let it happen. And Raphael Warnock. Like, you just can't do it there. If you move to Idaho as an aggressive right-wing Christian supremacist, you only have to deal with Boise. That's your bet. And a lot of folks are like, I'll take that bet. You know why? Because Boise and the rest of Idaho are 94% white. So like, try it in Texas and you run into the brown folks, the Black folks, the Asian folks, the queer folks. Try it in Georgia, not going to happen. Try it in PA. We still got Philly. We still got Pittsburgh. We still got tried in Maryland. It's just not going to happen. Even in Tennessee, I used to live in Memphis. It's just not going to happen. But we'll try it in Boise. There's no long-standing communities of color in Idaho. There's no 4 or 5 generations long Jewish neighborhood over there. 50,000 Korean folks. Just not there. So what comes next? I'm sorry for a long-winded answer. Part of what comes next is this sense of like self-segregation and trying to convince yourself you can still create this kind of Christian supremacist utopia. Now, what that leads me though is to, what about those who can't move to Idaho and Montana and Wyoming? Well, I think about those folks from my hometown, the small business owners, who like, they can't move to Idaho because their whole livelihood is back where I grew up. And where I grew up is now more people of color, less Christian, less whatever. You know what's happened to all of them? Way to the right. They have gone way to the right. Like when I grew up with these folks, I don't hear about them talk about politics once. Now that it's MAGA hat, MAGA flag over the business, take over the school board, all that stuff. They can't leave. They've seen their community look more and more like America as it is, right? The demographically, and it's pushed them way to the right. So I think that's one. I think two, and I'm curious, Robbie, you have much, you of course are absolutely, plugged into the numbers and the statistics and all those things better than anyone. My next book project is about a movement that is not calling for a Christian nation, but is calling for Christendom. Like we're kind of past, hey, I want this to be a Christian nation again, a la the Reagan years. There's folks just openly saying, I just want to go back to Christendom. Like, I want a monarch. I want a Caesar. I want a king. I want a Christian prince. And revival will look like deporting 10 million people. Revival will look like the death penalty for women who get an abortion. Revival will look like repealing the 19th Amendment so women can't vote. Like, that's just starting to become an open Christian position. And it's merging with the likes of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and a lot of monarchists who are not your traditional Christian nationalist types. So what comes next to me is not not calls for a Christian nation as we've seen them, but calls for medieval Christendom in ways that are even more extreme. Now, will that gain traction? Will that gain political power? The first answer will come in the next week as we see what happens with this election. But that's where my mind is. And I know we don't have time for, sorry, I'm going on and on here. But JD Vance is the representative of that. If you all think that JD Vance was just picked to be like Mr. Midwest, shore up Pennsylvania, I think that's dead wrong. He was picked because he's a reactionary Catholic convert who represents the fusion of that Catholic monarchism and that Silicon Valley monarchism, and they see him as the future. Now, whether he is the future or not, we can debate, but to me, that's why he was picked. He was not picked to be sort of a Midwest firebrand who could win Trump, Pennsylvania.
All right, Brad, you're scaring me, and that's not easy to do. I'm not often in the position where I'm the optimist or I'm the hope guy. I'm usually this is what's scaring me. I actually just wrote, maybe you may have seen a piece like what's keeping the kind of survey
I did see it. Yeah.
Data that's keeping me up at night. I mean, so that's kind of where I'm living now. But I don't want to lose one thread of David's question. So maybe I'll push you a little bit. So it's like, people, what's our defense? So, but another way of asking that, like, where do you see some hope? Like, where might it not all be? I've got a couple thoughts on that, but I'm gonna let you take a swing at that first.
So I'm gonna give hope pre-election if that's okay. And I just think that I think we're in a place where for the last two presidential cycles, polling has been really unreliable. And I don't know how you feel about that, Robbie. Is you're a sociologist. You're obviously somebody who's dialed into numbers and statistics and demographics way more than I am. But I'm in a place where I think that there are a lot more Republicans and independents who have turned away from the MAGA movement than are perhaps being captured. I think the turnout among women and the way they're outpacing the turnout from 4 years ago is incredibly hopeful. I think that the unregistered, younger, and especially non-white independents and their kind of turnout is also hopeful to me. So I'm not into hopium. I'm not into unrealistic prognostications. I think Donald Trump's a lot less popular than is being shown right now. I think there's a need for a horse race for certain outlets to kind of do what they need to do in the run-up to an election. I think there's a Trump campaign that's paying for certain polls to show a kind of close race that will lead the national average to appear closer. So I fully think, and I'm not trying to give anyone false hope, but if you said right now, what do you think is going to happen? I think Kamala Harris is going to win. And I think she's going to win in a way that might be surprising. Now, that doesn't mean we stop. It doesn't mean put on the brakes and, go to brunch and forget about organizing and writing postcards and calling and whatever you all are doing. It just means I think there is hope that this election is going to go a different way than it looks right now and that it's not actually as close. Now, I don't like saying those words out loud because I don't want to give anyone a reason to be lackadaisical. But I'm in that place. I've told the people in my channels recently, we can stare into the abyss. It's not going to help us. I'd rather look at each other and I'd rather look at what's ahead and just keep marching and going. And we'll confront what happens on Tuesday when it happens.
That's great. Well, I'll add just a couple of things. I mean, one, let me just go ahead and give everyone permission to stop hitting refresh on those polling averages. At this point, they're not going to tell us anything we don't already know. So, I would say like the forecasting models are not going to tell us much that we don't already know. And that is that it's just too close to call. And it's all going to come down to turnout, who turns out, who votes. That's really what's going to come down to. So you can really free yourself. I'm literally not going to do it. Right. And this is what I do for a living, but I am not hitting refresh. I think it's been a week since I've looked at the polling averages, because once I realized we were down in the home stretch, they're all a toss up, every battleground state and the national polls. We're just not going to get anything. They're giving us snapshots in time, and all those polls are 700-800 people. The margin of error on each of those polls is 3 to 4 percentage points. We're not going to find anything outside that margin of error, right? So it's all going to be about turnout, and we're going to have to wait and see how it shakes out. The other thing to remember is that anyone who's doing predictive modeling is, doing their best, but they're doing it with exceptionally faulty data, because the best way to model a current election is by the last election. And what was going on the last time we had an election? A pandemic, right? So there's just no way to model kind of voter turnout, voting early, like all that, vote by mail versus in person, like that's all out the window because of the particular circumstances. And we also have 4 more years of people who were not eligible to vote last time who are now eligible to vote. And nobody knows what their voting patterns are going to be because there's no track record. So that younger end of Gen Z, we'll see. We know they're a heavily Democratic constituency, but whether they turn out, we'll have to wait and see. So there's just so many of that. So you can absolutely unhandcuff yourselves from the refresh button, and like I said, go out and take a walk rather than doing that going forward. The one thing on this topic I'll say that gives me hope is just to remember this: that we're living in this also in this world where because white Christian people still do turn out to vote at rates higher than other Americans do. And again, we'll have to wait and see if that holds this year, but historically that's been true. What it means is that the demographics of the ballot box look like the country did a decade ago. So it's a little bit like a time machine, right? That sort of is in Republicans' favor, that pulls us back about 10 years so if we had everybody voting, it would look drastically different. But because of differential turnout, we have this kind of time machine effect that takes us back about 10 years. This is about a 10-year lag effect before the actual demographics of the country become fully reflected at the ballot box. So that's one other kind of dynamic we're dealing with. And so whatever the outcomes, you can kind of read that outcome as, oh, okay, so that's really what the demographics of the country looked like about a decade ago. It's actually, even though the vote took place today, it's not really reflective of where the country is today. And then the other thing to say is on Christian nationalism, we find that it's really only about 3 in 10 Americans that fully embrace this world, that are really sympathetic and leaning in to this world of Christian dominionism and entitlement. And it's 2 to 1 Americans that reject this view. But this view has captured one of our 2 political parties, and that is a huge amplifier and megaphone, right? That kind of distorts the influence that's out there. So if I can think about where we are and where the country is, we're really more like a 2/3, 1/3 country when it comes to the deeper values here than the half and half country that the partisan horse race tends to show us. So Brad, I'm going to leave you with the last word here. Among whatever else you want to say, I do want to tell us where people can find your work, the podcast, Axis Mundi Media, and they can get your book. Again, the book is Preparing for War, wherever books are sold, but where else can they kind of track you down and follow your work?
Sure. Thanks, Robbie. Yeah. So our show, Straight White American Jesus, we don't, it's a parody. So just, don't, it's hard to put that on a sticker and a hat. So we haven't found a good way to do that yet, but, we break down Christian nationalism, the religious right, and related topics every week. We do interviews on Monday. We've had Robbie on 2-3 times. We do a weekly roundup. So check that out. We're proud of that work. But going to the question, we also at Axis Mundi are trying to connect the ivory tower to the grassroots. So we've just put out a series called Sanctuary on the border between church and state. And it's an extensive look at the sanctuary movement from the 1980s to now, and the Christians who have acted with radical hospitality to welcome refugees and welcome the neighbor. And it is for me a bulwark against despair when I think about what could be next, because there have always been people of faith who've acted with radical hospitality to welcome others, and studying the sanctuary movement and its history actually gives me hope. So you can catch that now. It's out. It's called Sanctuary on the Border Between Church and State from Axis Mundi Media. All of our stuff is at axismundi.us. And we feel really good about just trying to connect academic research and public scholarship to a variety of audiences around the country. Other than that, my book's out in paperback. Check it out. And there's, happy for you to reach out if you're somebody who's had any kind of interaction with Southern California, the American Redoubt, any of those migrations or any of those regions. The book's especially going to be pertinent. So I talked to a lot of folks who share a history with me, and have had a kind of similar background. So thankful for your invitation, Robbie. Thanks for having me here. And like everybody, we'll all do our best to stay in a good place as the next week unfolds.
Thanks, Brad. So again, Brad's book is Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. So thanks for, I know you're like me, a little weary
Yeah.
and a little tired. So thank you for talking to us and spending your time with us tonight and for sharing all of your wisdom and scholarship in writing on the podcast waves and elsewhere, and also helping other people's work get out with Axis Mundi Media. So thank you for that work. All right, everyone. So this has been the latest edition of White Too Long Author Forum, and we'll hope to see you next time.